Hello, welcome back to another video. I'm Michelle, an illustrator and concept artist who's trying to explore traditional media. This is going to be a mostly unscripted video of a full process colored sketch, done in my Canson XL mixed media sketchbook, with Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils, Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolors, a mechanical pencil, and a white gel pen. In real time, this took roughly 45 minutes, but I sped it up to 3 times the original speed for this video. I started off with the pencil sketch. This is a part I rarely show in my Draw With Me videos, but it's actually the most important step. The foundation, if you will, to all those transparent layers that I build on top of it. If something is off with the construction or proportions here, it'll be evident in the finished sketch. I think this is one of the reasons why many artists consider watercolor the most difficult wet medium. For me personally though, this step is actually the one I'm the most comfortable with. I've been drawing with pencil and paper as long as I can remember. It's much easier for me to visualize form with line than it is with value, likely because I learned how to draw this way. When I look back at old drawings and sketchbooks, almost everything is done with pencil or pen with little to no color. Other people naturally gravitate towards value and color as a way to describe form. For them, opaque mediums like acrylic or oil might feel easier than watercolor. While I was also drawn to the ability to work from dark to light and vice versa with these mediums, watercolor was ultimately my pick. Anyway, just because I like pencil doesn't mean things always go smoothly. I was rusty at the start of the sketch session, and I think it really shows. The features keep on shifting around, and I keep on erasing and redrawing areas. If I was erasing this much on cotton paper, I'd be afraid of damaging the paper's fibers. Luckily for me, this is a relatively inexpensive sketchbook, made from cellulose instead of cotton. I'm not going to layer a ton of paint on top of the sketch, and I'm also not expecting a polished result, so I'm much more liberal with the amount of erasing I do. This stage is going to go on for a little bit longer, so I figured I'd mention why I'm using the supplies I mentioned. Those of you familiar with my other studies might be surprised that I'm subjecting myself to cellulose paper when I love 100% cotton paper so much. For the record, I still believe the most important thing to invest in when you start with watercolor is 100% cotton paper. I just have a ton of cellulose or cellulose and cotton blend student grade papers sitting around that I don't really know what to do with. I've also still got plenty of paint left in my Cotman sketcher set. This list of supplies is what I had back in December when I first tried watercolor seriously. Part of me was curious to see what I could do with it now that I've learned so much. Would it still be frustrating to paint on cellulose paper? Spoiler alert, yes, but I think I've also figured out a few tricks to make it more manageable for me. At least now I know I can use this paper for practice and fast, loose sketches, or I guess fast for me, and also loose for me. If you've seen my other work, you know that I tend to try to get pretty polished and tight. Anyway, I finally figured out the eye placement, so I'll be lightening the graphite sketch with a kneaded eraser in just a moment. Graphite tends to smudge and smear when painted on top of, so I prefer using Faber-Castell Polychromos for my final lines in an underdrawing. The fact that I can use more colors is just the cherry on top. I love colored lines in my digital workflow, so I'm glad I can transfer that to traditional art. This time I'm only using walnut brown from the 12 pencil starter set. If you've ever wondered how many color pencils you should start out with for mixed media art, I'd recommend 12. Get the primaries, secondaries, a few shades of brown, and a black and white. You can always mix the rest of the colors from this selection. Then, later, if you realize that you really like color pencils, you can invest in a bigger assortment of colors. For me, my collection still consists of this set and a few Derwent drawing pencils in earth tones and a cool blue. I didn't set out to be an art supply minimalist, but I've realized by now that I prefer getting creative with a few colors instead of drowning in a sea of overwhelming choice. This also applies to my digital art. I'm one of those artists that has hundreds of custom brushes and brush packs in my toolkit, but I only really use 5 of them consistently. And yes, one of those brushes is the hard round default brush. It took me a while to accept this, and I'm aesthetically a bit of a maximalist, but my brain is much happier when I only give it a few options while I do something creative. It doesn't like to have to remember exactly how many browns and grays I have. It just wants to grab a brown, use it, and then move on to solving the next visual problem. Are any of your brains like that? Tangent on art supplies aside, it's time to finally paint. The big difference between cellulose and cotton paper is how it handles water. Cellulose can only take so many wet washes before it begins to break down, so I try to simplify my process. I started with one wash that established all the base colors and areas of light versus overall shadow. My reference was fairly desaturated, so I spend plenty of time neutralizing warms and cools with their complements to reach brown and gray. What looks intense right now is going to dry much lighter. That's the nature of watercolor. It lightens and sometimes loses vibrancy when it dries. This dry shift isn't as extreme with professional/artist grade paint, but the Cotman colors dry much lighter than they look when wet. My paintings were all too light and desaturated when I first started because of this. After 8 months, I know these paints well enough to compensate for their dry shift. Even so, I'm going to need another layer of color once this one dries. Another thing you might have noticed is how the paint flows. My sketchbook is on an angle, so paint gathers at the bottom edge of each stroke. This makes it easier to get even washes, well, even for cellulose, it's never going to compete with actual cotton paper, and it keeps me from oversaturating one area. Even so, I try to focus on big shapes and simple brush strokes. The more I work the paper, the more issues will arise later on. I don't want the paper to start pilling like an old sweater. If that happens, I won't be able to get smooth washes or add more detail on top of it. It's happened before, and the only way I could save that study was to jump back into color pencil. The other important thing to do is to let the paper dry completely between washes. I used a heat gun and also a 10-minute waiting period between this layer and the background layer. Once I laid down the background though, I had a new problem: contrast. Against the white of the paper, the shadows on the face look dark enough, but against a dark background, everything feels washed out. I knew this was going to happen, but I decided adding the background was worth it, if only to frame this portrait on the page. Theoretically, the solution was easy. All I needed to do was deepen the shadows. Practically, this launched me straight into the dreaded ugly face. When I was younger, if a painting or sketch looked like this, I took it as a sign to move on. I still make mistakes like this now, as you can see. The difference is I know how to fix them. Or rather, I know how to adapt to them. My problems were twofold. One, there were too many hard edges, especially between the transitions from light to shadow on the face. 2, now there was too much contrast on the face. This is why you test mixtures before slapping them down on your painting. I was tempted to scrub and lift on the edges, but I resisted. Cotton paper, especially paper in a heavier weight, can handle those techniques. Cellulose can't. At least this paper can't. It's only 160 GSM. For comparison, the cotton paper I usually use is 300 GSM. Luckily, I could still go darker in my lights. By adding shadows to the light half of the face and hair, it decreased the contrast when compared to the darker half. However, that didn't mean I erased all of my initial highlights. I left some alone, especially in areas where they gave information about the underlying form, like the curve on the highlight on the hair and the side plane of the nose. It's taken me a while, but I'm finally getting better at preserving whites in watercolor. The other thing I could do was unify the shapes. I melded all the shadows by the ear and jaw into one big shadow. This draws less attention to this area because there are fewer complex shapes here. From there, I focused on the details and contrast on the light half of the face. It was nice to work looser this way. Since I couldn't paint over and over in one area, I had to make faster, more intuitive decisions. A couple months ago, I mentioned wanting to simplify my process. Since then, though, I feel like I've gone in the opposite direction by adding more glazing and detail layers. I like the results from the last couple of studies, but I still want to be able to sketch and render loosely with watercolor. Cellulose paper hopefully will help with that goal, as long as I don't try to use it for longer studies that might frustrate me. I don't feel as precious with cellulose paper because it's cheaper, and I still have a stash of it I haven't touched in months. Meanwhile, I'm also still on the fence about the paints. Part of me wants to save my professional paints for rendered studies and eventually final illustrations. The other part of me is pointing out the fact that it takes months to get through even tiny dollops of paint that are less than a quarter pan, so using my professional paint on casual studies isn't going to use it up that much faster. That part of me also points out the fact that I don't want to form bad habits with student paint. If I use the Cotman set regularly, it might interfere with the techniques and mixing memory I formed for my Daniel Smith colors. Since I want to eventually only use professional paints in the future, and I definitely won't be buying more student grade paint, does it really make sense to use the student paint just for the sake of using it up? I don't have a clear answer right now, but these are the kinds of things I think about while painting, when I'm not just focused on technical stuff. There's a good chance I'm overthinking this, but hey, at least it gives my brain something to chew over instead of just getting stuck in perfectionism. We're at the end of the second-ish layer of color. I let everything fully dry again at this point, with a little bit of extra help from that heat gun, before adding in my final darkest darks. This black is a mixture of ultramarine, phthalo blue, alizarin crimson hue, pale cadmium red hue, phthalo green, and burnt sienna. Basically half the Cotman palette. To get a mixture this deep, I had to essentially create a paste with very little water. This stage made me really miss my Daniel Smith colors. It would have been easy to get an inky black with those paints because of their much higher pigment load. The mixture also wouldn't have to be this dry to stay true black, so it would have been easier to spread and keep even. You know what? I think I'm gradually convincing myself to just use my Daniel Smith paints. They bring me more joy when I use them. This Cotman set was a great starting point. It introduced me to the idea of a split primary palette and showed me how useful and beautiful earth tones are, but I've since moved on. Okay, we're at the color pencil stage now, or rather color pencil part 2. I've gone as far as I can with watercolor on this paper. You can see some mottled texture in the shadows where the paper was threatening to pill. I didn't want to risk my luck, so I switched to dry media. As much as I love cold pressed paper, I do appreciate smooth paper for mixed media. I can get precise strokes with a pencil on this paper and also layer multiple colors if I want to. Even still, I try to keep the rendering to a minimum, since I don't want the watercolor to be overshadowed by the color pencil. I think this is largely successful until we get to the cheek. That section will play in a minute or so from now, but the main issue is value. I accidentally painted over the light hitting the front of the cheek, which in turn created a strange shadow where there should be light but instead is dark. I couldn't fix this with watercolor since this paper doesn't take kindly to lifting, and besides that, watercolor is meant to be painted from light to dark. I thought about using gouache, but I decided to stick to pencil. In retrospect, gouache would have been easier and was probably the right choice. It's easier to blend gouache into watercolor since they're both water-soluble mediums. And I know gouache plays well with this type of watercolor. Alas, I chose color pencil. Things start out okay, but quickly start to go south. The white pencil left a harsh line, and the brighter orange only emphasized this issue. When I tried to unify things with brown, I ended up pressing too hard and started burnishing the paper, which reduced the effectiveness of subsequent layers of color pencil. I had thought I was in the easier part of the study with finishing touches, but hey, sometimes you make mistakes here too. I tried rubbing at the area to see if I could maybe smooth it out with my finger. Nope. I also tried using a white gel pen as a gouache substitute, but I was starting to realize by this point that this was going to need a much larger fix. Since the paper was burnished, color pencil wasn't an option, and pen wouldn't be able to cover such a large area evenly while still allowing some of the darkness to peek through. At this point, I decided I needed a wet medium again. I could have broke out the white gouache at this point, but instead I looked at the Chinese white in the Cotman watercolor palette and thought, I rarely touch this paint, but maybe. Luckily for me, it ended up working out okay. I just want to note that this isn't a great technique if you're finishing an illustration that you want to sell in the future, since layering water on top of wax or oil-based mediums isn't exactly archival. But for a quick sketch in a sketchbook, it ends up doing the job. Anyway, thanks for joining me on a slightly rambling look at a full process sketch. As always, I hope you create something that brought you joy this week, and I'll see you Friday with a video where I use both traditional and digital mediums. Bye!